everyone. Thanks for joining. I know it's an early session, so I know it was really fun, hanging out last night. So we can just start talking about real-time data and how we can get real-time data by using Graph and Azure Event Hubs. Before I start, can you hear me well, or should I just stand in front of mic? Is it better? It's better? Okay, then let me stay here. So before we start, let me introduce myself. My name is Ayça. I live in Dubai. I'm originally Turkish. I work at Microsoft for 5 years. Currently, I'm a senior cloud advocate. But before that, for 4 years, I worked as a premier field engineer with customers all around Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So I have a very hands-on experience in terms of pro developer side. So how many of you are a pro dev here? Awesome. So today will be a little bit more about pro dev, but we have some stuff for Power Automate as well, since April is here. If you want to stay connected, you can, connect through LinkedIn or Twitter. We can stay in touch. I'm sure I'm already connected with some of you. So before we start, I just want to thank our sponsors, and let's jump right into it. As you know, all of us use Microsoft 365, I'm assuming, in our day-to-day work. Which app is your favorite? My favorite is, I don't know if it is favorite, but I know that I use Teams a lot because of communication, chatting, and so on. But I also use To-Do most of the time for keeping my tasks. And no one has favorite in Microsoft 365? Oh, yeah. You have to say Teams since you're MVP for Teams. Awesome. So how many of you worked with Graph before, Microsoft Graph? You have an experience with Graph. This is awesome. So you know that we can actually connect with our data in Microsoft 365 Cloud by using Graph. And today's session will be mostly about how to get data from Microsoft 365 and then consuming that data to build real-time applications. And in the Graph world, as you know, that we have so many data sets, hundreds of different data sets. In Microsoft 365 Cloud, we can connect with Teams data, To-Do, basically email, anything you can think of. And since you're already experienced, you know that Microsoft Graph Explorer is a great place to explore Graph. If you haven't worked with Graph before, I can direct you to Developer's Guide to Graph link. You can just check out that link to learn more about Microsoft Graph and discover a little bit what you can build with it. There are too many scenarios we actually work with Microsoft Graph. Of course, we build Teams apps to increase productivity. We also build bots to gather some data, show some data to the end user. But starting with COVID, we actually had, at the beginning of COVID, I was a premier field engineer, and I worked with many customers at Microsoft. And at the beginning of COVID, especially, we received so many requests from many customers, many big customers, about how they can get real-time data. For example, schools or Ministry of Education, they ask for attendance for the classes real-time, or if students or teachers are online at the moment, and so on, these sort of real-time data. Or at the same time, our workplace became Teams, as you know. So we wanted to learn more about our employees, how is their mental health, if they're working maybe too much on the after-work hours, and so on. All this data, as you know, can be accessible through Microsoft Graph API, and that's why real-time information became much more important. That's why we're going to talk about a scenario today. We will build an application, and this application, I don't know if you know Microsoft Graph Toolkit, but the Graph Toolkit is a product that we can use for embedding easy Microsoft 365 data. We use Microsoft Graph Toolkit components to connect with login features, and when we have the easy authentication, we can access the calendar data, tasks, email, basically anything you want from Microsoft 365 world. And then we will get some real-time presence changes from Microsoft 365. The reason we do that, because while you're collaborating real-time, not only Microsoft 365 apps like Teams or Outlook or any other app, but you can actually bring this experience into your apps as well. And it's not only for presence, of course. We have many other data sources that you can use this feature. But this time I just used the presence data set. And last night I actually received a message from one of the colleagues, like how they can get a real-time to-do task whenever a new task is created, how they can receive that data. The same feature is available for the rest of the Microsoft 365 data sets as well. If you want to receive notifications, real-time notifications from any sort of Microsoft 365 data sets, you can actually use this feature. Let me quickly show you how it looks like when we build an app with Microsoft Graph. So the first experience is login experience. You can use Microsoft Graph Toolkit components to embed this experience. I use the login component to add the sign-in button and MSAL provider. And after that, you will be directed to the Brainstorm app. Brainstorm app is something we build with Fluid Framework. But today, I'm not going to talk about this too much, the Fluid Framework too much, but I can share the links with you. The main feature we will discuss today is the notification. So whenever any of my colleagues became available, I would like to be informed about it. And then I will receive a notification about my colleague information. And if I want, I can invite my colleague by just clicking invite button, and my colleague will receive a notification on Teams with the Brainstorm app link, so he can join the same session with me, and we can start collaborating. So this is basically a custom experience you can build in your apps. As I mentioned, presence is just an example of one data set. You can have the real-time data for many other data sets available in Microsoft 365. And I talked about 3 different features here, actually. The first one is Microsoft Graph Toolkit. I added the login component, and then, as you can see, we have the person information here with the little icons, images, and the name, and so on. We built this first experience with Microsoft Graph Toolkit. The second experience I talked about is notification. Whenever someone is available, I will receive a notification about that person. And the third experience is when you click invite, you will send the notification to the user through Teams. So the last experience is built by Microsoft Graph Teams APIs. So you can just call the Microsoft Graph Teams APIs and send a notification to that person. But how about the second one? I know that the first one was Graph Toolkit. The last one was Microsoft Graph Teams API. How about the second one? Have you worked with any change notifications before? Have you heard of Microsoft Graph change notifications? Yes, so the second one will be something new for us. Of course, we had change notifications before, but we have new capabilities that work with Microsoft Graph change notifications that I will just walk you through. So Microsoft Graph change notifications was there for many years, and Graph change notifications is actually something that Microsoft Graph team uses a webhook mechanism in the background, so you can receive changes anytime if a new data is coming, or the data is updated, or something is deleted. By using Microsoft Graph change notifications, you can receive the notifications when there's a change in the data set. And this feature is available in many data sets, including Outlook, User, To-Do, Teams, and so on. So let's say that there's a new chat created on Teams, and someone ping you on Teams. You want to get this message and do something with it, then you can actually subscribe to the change notifications, and you will be getting informed about that data. Also, the same thing applies in our previous projects with many customers. We use user and the group information, and we basically check their login information if user was logging in. Think about teachers in the high schools. They use Teams often during COVID, so whenever they logged in, we wanted to be notified about that teacher's information or the student. We want to make sure that they're able to work with Teams, they're able to join their classes through Teams and so on. So you can basically get notified about all these features. You can track these changes in the data sets. So what's new in the change notifications? Of course, we always had the traditional webhook mechanism that you can subscribe customly, but how about when you have a huge data set? Let's say that we're thinking about not just one school, but you're thinking about the entire country. Ministry of Education is trying to build the entire education experience on Teams and trying to track all the data changes in the background. Probably it's like millions of data in an hour, not just a day. Like lots of teachers are logging in, logging out, maybe having some conversations with students and so on. So it's a lot of data. It would be really hard to manage this data by using the traditional webhook mechanism, right? So that's why, with all these needs, Microsoft Graph team built a new feature. Now we are able to use Microsoft Graph change notifications with Azure Event Hubs. The reason we do that, because Azure Event Hubs was there for many years. We use Event Hubs for real-time data collection. Actually, it's a really good product we use with IoT Hub as well, just to receive data real-time and digest data and send the notifications real-time. And since Graph is the point where we gather so much data from Microsoft 365, but we need to manage somehow and send this data real-time to somewhere else, Event Hub is actually a really good product to combine. So the point you may want to use Event Hub is when you have a large set of resources. As I said, maybe you have, I don't know, millions of students and teachers to handle, or in a company you have thousands of employees that you want to gather data from. Think about Microsoft, for example. If you try to gather presence status changes for the entire Microsoft employees, it is probably millions of presence status for 1 minute. So because everyone is just log in, log out all the time, changing their status, joining the calls and so on, it's a big data to digest in a custom app. So it would be really nice to have some cloud service to gather this data real time and handle in the cloud. And you may have change in high frequency, as I said, that people changing their status, like busy in the meeting, like it's changing all the time. It's hard to track all these changes. So you may get throttling quite easily in the situation. And finally, you can have resources across a large set of organizations. So there might be a huge number of people you have to manage. And this feature is available for all of the resources, which is available for the traditional webhook as well. So all of the data sets which already had the change notification service have the same experience with Event Hubs too. And the easiest way to build this experience is first, of course, create Event Hubs on Azure, and then you have to create a key vault as well. Just because of security reasons, we don't want to directly connect to Event Hubs connection string, because it's not going to be secure directly sending our information to Event Hubs. That's why Microsoft Graph team prefers to access Event Hub through key vault. It's because of the security reasons. You can keep all of your connection string, app settings, and all the informations in your key vault. It's nothing specific for Graph or Event Hubs. And then the experience will be in the same flow. When we will subscribe to any data set in Microsoft Graph change notifications, And then we will be placing the notifications to the Event Hub through Azure Key Vault. And whenever there's a change, we will be just sending all this information to Event Hubs. The only thing is that when you are subscribing to Microsoft Graph change notifications, URL will not be a custom URL. It will be just like the one I mentioned at the bottom. You will be setting notification URL as an Event Hub. And it's just a JSON call when you subscribe to change notifications to a dataset through Event Hubs. And when you define notification URL as an Event Hub, then you will be basically sending all of the change information to the Event Hub. And the rest will be just consuming the data however you like. You can connect with Event Hubs, and basically you can either build apps, you can build Power BI dashboards, you can build many stuff with this real-time data. So I want to start less, like I just want to show you how I build Azure part, and then how I build the subscription part first. And then in the following part, I will just show you how we consume this data coming from Event Hubs. So let's check. Okay, so I already set up some stuff on Azure. So have you ever worked with Microsoft Azure before? I'm sure you did. I hope you can see my screen, but I can zoom in a little more. So in this resource group, I have 4 things, but don't worry about Signalr and Azure functions. I will talk about them in the upcoming part. So I have basically 2 things that I want to show you. The first one is Event Hubs. The second one is Key Vault. When you create Event Hubs from scratch, it will just look like this, and you can track if data is coming or not from these dashboards. You can have multiple Event Hubs in one Event Hub namespace. Ours is Brainstorm M365 because our app is called Brainstorm app. And here you can actually check if data is coming in a healthy way, how many messages you're receiving. You can track all the changes from here. And the way to connect your Event Hub is through shared access policies. Here you create a policy. Here I created functions because I'm actually consuming Event Hubs through Azure Functions to send data somewhere else. As I mentioned, don't worry about it too much. But here is the connection string you can copy, and then you will keep this connection string in Azure Key Vault just because of security purposes. And let me just quickly show you where we keep our connection string in the Key Vault as well. Here is our Key Vault, and you can actually keep all of your secrets, all of your keys under this Key Vault. There's no limit about number of information you can keep in here. We have secrets, and we have keys, and we also have certificates, by the way. So you can basically keep your connection string by just generating secret, and then you will be accessing this information through Azure Key Vault. And finally, the most important part is you have to define Microsoft Graph Change Tracking app in the Key Vault so that Microsoft Graph Change Tracking app will be accessing all of the information, basically our connection string for Event Hub through Key Vault, and then we will be able to send all of the changes to our Event Hubs. And this is the point I use Power Automate. The reason we use Power Automate is because you set up the Key Vault, you set up the Event Hubs. Now you have your Event Hub connection string in your Key Vault. The next step is just to subscribe any data sets. In our scenario I mentioned, we are going to use a presence data set. So you can use to-do, Teams chats, recordings, like Teams call recordings and so on, anything actually you want. In our scenario, we just subscribe to presence. The way to do that, of course, you need to basically send a JSON, and you have to make a Graph API call. You can either do that in your app by writing code, or you can basically create a flow which basically renews itself every at the top of the hour, so you don't have to worry about if your subscription expired or not. Because let me quickly show you how I did this. Recurrence is every 61 minutes, and I chose a team on Microsoft Teams to subscribe. Basically, what I'm doing here is whoever is a part of M365 Advocates Teams team, then I will get this group information, and I will create an array for each and every person who is a part of that team. And finally, I will get members of the group, and I will just put their information in an array, and I will subscribe to their presence changes. Let's say that I'm in that team, April is in that team, Dan, Bob, all of my colleagues are in the same team. We will gather their IDs, and then we will subscribe to their changes. Here, output is the place we keep the user IDs. That means that whoever is in that team, we can basically subscribe to their presence changes. This is the subscription call we will need to make, and I built a custom connector on Power Automate to create graph calls here. This custom connector can be used for any graph call. For me, I am just using for the subscription graph call. And at the beginning, you can define change type. I hope you can see it. You can define change type as updated, deleted, created. And for us, whenever there's a change, I want to be informed. So I just choose updated. In the notification URL, as I mentioned, we will need to subscribe to not a custom URL, not to a custom webhook URL, but in this case, our URL will look like this, which is Event Hub, and then you will have your key vault URL, and then you will have your secret and your secret name. This is my secret name. That means that I can connect my connection string. And finally, you will have your tenant ID. It's a classic tenant ID for your organization. Finally, in your resource, you will have to define what is your resource you want to connect to. Here, if you want to track something else, as I mentioned, Teams chats, recordings, or let's say to-do tasks and so on, then you will have to change this resource. For me, it is communication presences, and I filter by the ID. So whoever is a part of that group, I will also get the information about that person's presence status. And the most important part, and the reason I use Power Automate, is the expiration date time. Our subscriptions expire at the top of the hour. So you have to either manage this in a custom code in your app, or as I mentioned, you can just use Power Automate with the recurrence, so it will be renewed at the top of the hour. I'm just too lazy to write too many code for renewing the subscription, so it's easier for me to just use Power Automate. And this is how we start getting information from Microsoft Graph change notifications. We just subscribe to our changes for presence, and we are sending all of the changes whenever someone is available, busy, and so on. All this data will be coming to our Event Hub on Azure. So whenever a new data is coming, you will have to see it in this graphic. Or you can actually use the Event Hub extension available on Visual Studio Code. You can get the JSON data, see the JSON data directly on the extension too. So this is one portion of it, and then I would like to just continue with my presentation. Okay, so we built the Event Hub, we built the Key Vault, and then we subscribe to our changes through Power Automate. And then next is getting the presence data real time in your app. I built a React app, but you can just use this data anywhere. It's easier to use it on Power BI. You can just choose the data source as Event Hubs and then build really good dashboards with it, with the good visuals and so on. But for our scenario, our Brainstorm app was used for collaboration purposes. That's why I just want to be notified about my colleagues' status changes. And that's the reason we built that. Let's quickly go through how we're gonna receive change notifications in our React app. So I have Microsoft Graph and Microsoft Graph change tracking app, which we define in the key vault, as you remember. So this app can access to connection string for our event hubs and can send all of the data. So what we did, we actually get event hub connection string from the key vault. We authenticate to Power Automate flow by using Azure Active Directory, and we create subscription for the graph change notifications, right? So far, we've already seen that. And now, whenever there's a change about the presence, then we will be sending this data to event hubs. So we don't have to do anything about this part. It's already set. So Power Automate actually did the subscription. So whenever there's a change, the URL that we use for sending the data, placing the data, will be our event hub. So this is already done. Let's check out how we are going to get this data from Event Hub to the React app. So to do that, we will use function apps. We will build Azure function apps. You can do that either locally in your Visual Studio Code, or you can just do that on Azure portal. We will place input as Event Hub messages. That means when there's a notification, we will send it to Azure Functions, and we will define output as Signalr. So Signalr is the tool that we use for sending real-time information to our web applications. And whenever there's a message there's a new information coming from Event Hub, it will directly go to Signalr, and Signalr will be broadcasting messages real-time to our app. Of course, as I mentioned, it's easier to get data on Power BI if you want to build good dashboards. But if you want to get your data in a web app, in a mobile app, and so on, you will have to have a server to carry your data real time. That's why we will need to use Signalr service to carry data real time in our app. Let me show you how the code side works. I built the functions on the code, as well as we built a Brainstorm app, and we connect with Signalr. Whenever a new notification is coming, we are just sending the notifications to our app. If you're interested in this scenario is available in Azure Architecture Center in Microsoft documentation. So you can just check out the URL, and there's a GitHub repo available as well. Just you can try if you're interested. So let me get my Visual Studio Code. Yep. Okay, so I know it looks messy, but don't worry about it. I will just go step by step. First of all, I just want to mention that if you go to the GitHub repository in the URL, you will see that we have the subscription flow and the custom connector available under M365 subscription flow folder. You don't have to worry about building the entire Power Automate flow from scratch. You can just upload this flow in your Power Automate, and then it should be hopefully working without a problem. And let's start with the functions. As I mentioned, it's fine. So there are two things we have to do in the functions. We have to define Azure Event Hubs as an input, and we should define Signalr as an output. That's as basic as it is. But before that, we will have to create a negotiate function for Signalr so that we can carry the Signalr connection information to Azure Functions, so that Signalr will be trusting to the Azure Functions and getting data from the functions. And let me quickly show you how I created Signalr, and you will understand how easy it is. You can just create Azure Signalr from the Azure portal, and the moment you do that, you will see that there's a connection string available. You will just copy this and use it in your application as a plain connection string, or you can use, again, key vault to access your connection string. It's totally up to you. But this is pretty much it. We don't do anything, on Azure portal, but just we create Signalr from Azure portal, and that's all. And in our app, in the negotiate function, it's actually a template function. When you create a function on Azure portal or on your Visual Studio Code, you will see that as a type of function, we already have negotiate. By choosing the negotiate function, you will see that this template is coming automatically, so you don't have to write any code actually. Make sure that you create your Signalr serverless and you define your hub name as serverless, so that we don't have to worry about any server-side stuff, that Azure will handle everything. Once we trust our Signalr on our app, on Azure Functions, that means that Azure Functions now can send information, any notification, any event to the Signalr. The next step is broadcast. Broadcast means is, as I mentioned, we will need to define bindings as input. We will need event hub messages. As an output, we will need Signalr messages. That means that, let me quickly show you the index.js. It's pretty straightforward. Whenever there is event hub messages coming for each event hub messages, we just stringify the JSON, because as you can imagine, from graph, we are receiving a huge amount of JSON. So we will need to send this JSON data to our Signalr. So Signalr messages is actually carrying our data that we created under the context. There are two things I can do here. Either I can send the entire JSON to Signalr and handle everything in my code, or instead I can define whatever information I need from that graph response. So in here, I basically refine the information I need. Instead of just sending one page of JSON, I'm only sending ID and availability of person. So I don't need to worry about writing any other code, actually. So here we will get user ID and user presence status. In this case, whenever there is an event hub message, we refine the event hub message and send ID and availability to our Signalr. And once we do that from Azure Functions, then you're basically ready to go. You can use this functionality in your app. If you're running your Azure Functions locally, you will have to define all of your settings, connection strings, and so on in the local settings JSON. But my app is running on Azure right now, and my functions are all on Azure too. So if you're running everything on Azure, you can just keep your connection strings, all of your keys on Azure too. You don't have to use local settings JSON. Just for the testing purposes, I'm sure you will need local settings JSON, so keep in mind. Once we're done with the functions, we're just moving to our app. So our app, as you know, everything starts with index.tsx, and as you see in our brainstorm experience, we have Microsoft Graph Toolkit for the login and the people information. And you can find all that information at the beginning. We use Microsoft Graph Toolkit MSAL2 provider to do that. And once our app starts running, we actually automatically call Signalr Connection. That means that the moment you start running your app, Signalr will start listening the changes coming from Event Hub. So whenever something is happening, you will see in the background that Signalr will be getting data automatically. So let's quickly go to Signalr Connection, TSX. This is the place that we connect with Signalr, and basically this piece of code is super easy to find. It's in the documentation. You can just copy paste. It's the place where we connect our Signalr and we send the information. The message can be edited any way you want. You can either just send message the way it is, or you can just build a new function. For me, I just send message as in the notification function. I created notification function because I don't want to just show text data on screen. I want to create a really cool pop-up experience for my users. So that's why I built this notification function. In the notification function, I have two things. I have graph chat, which is the place when you click on invite, you send notification to the user through Teams. And the second one is the main one, which is the notification function. This is the place where we check the user availability. Of course, in the Brainstorm app, I don't want to be notified if Dan is do not disturb. I want to be informed if Dan is available, so I can invite him to join me. That's why I build a really simple query, if loop here. If the user availability is available, and if user is not logged in, so he's not a part of the Brainstorm app yet, I can just send the toast notification here. And here I also use Microsoft Graph Toolkit components. So you don't have to write too much code if you're not if you're too lazy to write the front-end code. It's easier to use Microsoft Graph Toolkit components. And I added a button simply. And also, one more thing I wanted to add. If, let's say that when we are brainstorming with Dan April in the Brainstorm app, let's say my machine crashes and all of a sudden I'm offline, and believe me, sometimes it happens. I just want to make sure that others in the Brainstorm app get notification about me when we are in the collaboration, so that they know that I am all of a sudden offline, so I'm not in the Brainstorm app anymore. That's why we also get notification from the user, whoever is logged in already, and if their status changes, we can say that iChat status is updated as offline or away or something like that. And finally, as you remember, in our app, we have the invite button, and this is a straightforward button we call. And on click, as you can see here, we have the graph chat code, which does the straightforward Microsoft Graph call. So here we call Microsoft Graph Teams APIs, and whenever we want to invite someone else, we just click on the button, and when we call the button, we create a one-on-one chat with that person. If there is a chat already, then we just send a notification with the URL. So this is a straightforward call for Microsoft Graph, nothing special about it. We just do the post for chats. And this is pretty much all. And the reasons we use Microsoft Graph with Event Hubs is basically to get data real time. And we wanted to have different experiences, not just Event Hub, but because there are so many other great tools in Azure that we should be able to connect. That's why there is one last thing I want to share with you. So now, 2-3 days ago, it is announced that Microsoft Graph Change Notifications are available to work with Azure Event Grid as well, which is a quite game changer in my opinion, because if you're working with real-time data, Event Grid is the most prioritized place that you go on Azure. And I believe it will be quite important when it's in GA, but it is announced 3 days ago that it's in public preview. If you're interested, you can also check out this URL to get more information how you can connect with Event Grid. Unfortunately, we don't have any documentation yet around it. Probably it's going to be the first thing that we will work as a team. But it shouldn't be so different than Event Hubs. I'm sure instead of just defining Event Hub URL, you can just connect to the Event Grid URL, and then you will use Key Vault to secure your connection string, and that should be all about it. So before I close out, I just want to take time to thank all of our sponsors. And as I mentioned, if you're interested in this scenario, and if I explain some things really complex, you can just check out the link. read about it, and then there's a GitHub repo that you can just fork and try yourself. If you want to add something new, feel free to create pull requests, and we can add your feature, or we can work together in the new ideas as well. So, any questions? Yes.
How do you learn about all these new things? Because this is the first time I've ever heard of Azure Connection.
I know. The problem is Azure has more than 200 products. It's hard to connect with all of these. We try to write about all these changes, especially for me, it is Graph and Teams. We try to write all of the new changes on devlogs of Microsoft. And also we try to talk about them in the events like this. I believe for specific to other Azure tools, probably the Microsoft blogs are the best place to go, because it is impossible to find Learn modules for all of these features. For example, for this specific one, we managed to create Azure Architecture Center documentation, but there's nothing about it on Learn. So I guess best place is to subscribe to devlogs or follow us on Twitter. I don't know. Probably it's the best thing you can do. There are so many changes happening on Azure world, in the Power Platform or Microsoft 365. Of course, it's impossible to track all of these. But this feature was so critical for the big customers especially. It was highly requested by the high number of employed companies or the ministries and so on. So this feature was quite expected over a year now. Yes?
Yeah, I think just to answer the question as well, on YouTube is a channel called Enrich, so you get notification by it as well.
Awesome. Any other question? No? All right, so I can just give 7 minutes back to you. Enjoy your time, the last day in Scottish Summit. Yes?
Can you show the demo again, quick?
Of course. I hope not. I hope not. So you don't want to part with the code, right? So
No, we saw it.
okay. Oof. Let me.
Take it from the top.
Okay. This is pre-recorded because we recorded this with my colleague, just to make sure we are 2 people on Teams. But this is a brainstorm app. You can log in, and the login experience is built with Microsoft Graph Toolkit. It comes with the good UI and also easy authentication. So when you build it, you will basically get this login experience with the button, and when you logged in, it comes with the picture profile information of the person, so you don't have to worry about building the front-end code. And once you're in the brainstorm app, this is a React app, super custom, so nothing special about it. We just get the real-time presence notification whenever someone in my team is available. I get a notification about that person. When I click invite, I just send the brainstorm app URL to that person. So then we'll receive a notification from me saying that come join us to collaborate. And then when he clicks on this URL, then he will be joining the same brainstorm app session with me. This experience is built with Fluid Framework, by the way. We are just talking about the real-time presence, but there's actually a second part of this demo that my colleague Dan built. It is using Fluid Framework, and you can basically collaborate real-time on your custom apps. So here we have notes, for example. Whenever we add notes, you can just see it real-time. I will see it real-time on my screen, or whoever is in the same session. They will also see it real-time, the changes. So this is pretty much it. We just track the presence data from Microsoft Graph Change Notifications and send it through Azure Event Hubs. And it is almost impossible to do that with a traditional webhook mechanism, because if you receive more than 100 data in a second, it will be throttled. It is impossible to manage that data, that amount of data customly. So that's the reason we use Azure services. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for joining.